before the first American reached the bluffs above Omaha Beach, before the bunkers fell silent, before the German lines began to crack. There were men inside concrete strongpoints who believed they could stop the invasion of Europe. They had been told the Atlantic Wall would hold. They had been told the Allies would break against German firepower. They had been told that if the invasion came, the invaders would be thrown back into the sea. Then dawn came on June 6th, 1944, and out of the mist they saw a horizon covered in ships. Not dozens, not hundreds, thousands. For the German defenders staring out from Normandy, D-Day did not begin as a battle. It began as a shock so enormous that it almost defied belief. Offshore was the greatest invasion fleet ever assembled, 6,939 Allied vessels supporting the assault. Overhead came a sky dominated by Allied air power, so overwhelming that German resistance in the air was almost meaningless. The Allies flew 14,674 sorties that day. The Luftwaffe's response in the sector amounted to just 2 aircraft. That contrast alone told the story. But for the German soldiers on the ground, especially at Omaha Beach, the story would unfold minute by minute, bunker by bunker, in blood, smoke, and disbelief. At Strong Point, WN-62, one of the defensive positions overlooking Omaha, German machine gunner Heinrich Sevelow prepared to fire into the killing zone below. The defenses there were formidable. Omaha's sector contained concrete bunkers, resistance nests, trenches, mines, wire, and interlocking fields of fire designed to turn the beach into a slaughterhouse. The German position had been built for exactly this moment. If the enemy landed here, they were supposed to die here. And in the first hours it looked like that might happen. As American troops approached the shore, many of them were exposed, disoriented, and pinned down almost immediately. Landing craft were torn apart. Men jumped into deep water under machine gun fire. Units became mixed together. The carefully planned assault dissolved into chaos. On the bluffs, German defenders opened fire with rifles, mortars, artillery, and especially the MG-42, a weapon whose rate of fire made it one of the most terrifying machine guns of the war. From the German perspective, this was the invasion they had imagined, a massacre at the waterline. They could see men falling in the surf. They could see bodies gathering on the sand. They could see American soldiers hugging sea walls and obstacles, unable to move forward. In those opening moments, some defenders must have believed their officers had been right. Maybe the Atlantic Wall would hold. Maybe this invasion really could be crushed before it ever broke through. But the Germans were seeing only one part of the battlefield. What they could not fully grasp in those early hours was the scale of the force pressing against them. This was not a raid. This was not another temporary landing. This was the concentrated military and industrial power of the United States, Britain, and their allies, arriving all at once with a level of coordination and sustainment Nazi Germany could no longer match. Even where the German defenses were inflicting terrible casualties, the assault did not stop. More landing craft came in. More naval gunfire came down. More men found gaps in the wire, dead ground between strong points or narrow routes up the bluffs. Again and again, small groups of American soldiers improvised under fire, working their way past the strongest defenses instead of dying in front of them. The German system depended on holding together as a network. Once individual positions began to get isolated, the strength of the fortifications became a weakness. A bunker could dominate the beach in front of it. It could not easily defend itself from behind. And that is where the psychological shift began. For the German defenders, the terrifying realization was not just that the enemy had landed. It was that the enemy kept coming, no matter how much fire was thrown at them. Allied naval and air power had not erased the defenses completely, but it had added a crushing layer of pressure. Communications were strained. Movement in daylight became dangerous. Units were forced to fight in fragments. And as American troops climbed the heights and began attacking from unexpected angles, one by one the strong points that had seemed immovable became vulnerable. The men inside them were no longer watching an invasion fail. They were watching it survive. And once it survived, they were watching it grow. That was the deeper horror of D-Day through German eyes. It was not simply a tactical shock. It was the moment when Germany's soldiers on the Western Front began to confront the fact that they were trapped in a kind of war. They could not win. The Allies did not just have courage. They had reach. They had replacements. They had fuel, ships, aircraft, radios, engineering units, naval guns, and the ability to keep feeding men and material into the fight at a scale the Wehrmacht could not match. The contrast became even sharper inland. German commanders had expected to counterattack and destroy the beachhead before it could solidify. In theory, that was the only hope. Hit fast, hit hard, and drive the invaders back into the sea. But theory collided with reality almost immediately. The 21st Panzer Division launched a counterattack, one of the few armored responses the Germans managed on D-Day itself. Yet even that effort revealed the larger problem. German forces were constrained by confusion, delays, fragmented command, Allied air superiority, and the sheer speed at which the beachhead was expanding. This was no clean, decisive armored blow. It was an increasingly desperate attempt to strike an enemy that was already digging in, linking up, and building strength by the hour. And above it all, the Luftwaffe was almost absent. For German soldiers on the ground, that absence mattered. Air power is not only destructive, it is psychological. To hear enemy aircraft overhead all day, while seeing virtually none of your own, is to understand, at a gut level, who controls the battlefield. The defenders of Normandy were facing not just an invasion force, but an entire war machine operating almost without interruption. By the end of the day, many German assumptions were already dead. The Atlantic Wall had not prevented the landings. The beachhead had not been erased. The enemy had not been thrown back. And once those illusions were gone, something even worse began to creep in. Perspective. German officers and soldiers could still fight. They could still delay. They could still kill. But increasingly, they were forced to see the broader imbalance. This was the industrial war Germany had feared. Not in speeches, not in statistics on a map. Right in front of them. The Americans alone represented a level of productive power that made attrition a losing equation for Germany. Back in the United States, factories like Ford's Willow Run were turning out B-24 bombers at staggering speed, one every 63 minutes. That mattered in Normandy because industrial power does not stay in factories. It becomes landing craft. It becomes ammunition. It becomes fuel. It becomes trucks, aircraft, radios, spare parts, bulldozers and reinforcements. It becomes the ability to absorb losses and keep attacking. The German defenders on June 6th did not need an economics lecture to understand that. They could see it in the sea. They could hear it in the sky. D-Day was not the final collapse of German resistance in the West. That would come later, after weeks of brutal fighting in Normandy, after hedgerow battles, after failed attempts to contain the Allied breakout. Men like Hans von Luck and others would continue fighting, as the front bent and then broke. But the logic of the campaign had changed. What began on the beaches ended in catastrophe. Weeks later, the destruction of German forces in the Falaise pocket would drive the lesson home with terrible finality. Trapped, shattered, and retreating under relentless pressure, around 50,000 German troops surrendered there. By then, the illusion of stabilizing the Western Front had all but collapsed. Normandy had not just been a landing. It had become a machine for grinding down Germany's remaining strength. And for many German soldiers, the true meaning of D-Day was not just that the Allies got ashore, it was that June 6th exposed the future. The Wehrmacht had built bunkers, laid mines, positioned guns, and trusted in doctrine, discipline, and defensive terrain. But none of that could overcome an enemy that combined bravery at the point of attack with overwhelming industrial depth behind it. The German defenders at Omaha and across Normandy were not merely beaten by tactics in a single day. They were forced to confront the industrial superiority of an opponent that could turn one successful landing into an unstoppable campaign. That is what makes D-Day through German eyes so powerful. It is not only the story of men firing from bunkers or tanks moving too late, or generals scrambling under impossible conditions. It is the story of realization. Realization that the wall would not hold. Realization that the sky belonged to the enemy. Realization that the sea itself had become a supply line too vast to sever. And realization that this was no longer a war Germany could win, no matter how fiercely individual soldiers fought. On Omaha Beach, the first American wave suffered terribly. The defenders inflicted exactly the kind of punishment the Atlantic Wall had been designed to deliver. But by the end of that day, the men who had watched the morning assault through gun sights and bunker slits were seeing something very different. They were seeing American troops on the bluffs. They were seeing the beginning of a front that would not disappear. It became a verdict.